I've been getting rather irritated this week to hear the BBC's Making It Clear jingles like this one.
Election 2015. Making it clear.
Clear as mud. There's been no proper discussion about economics at all, particularly to do with the fundamentals of the money system and whether that's ever going to change, and also whether we're sitting on a cliff as regards to the potential of a financial crash, as Martin mentions week after week. Martin, this week we've got, yesterday in fact, both on the same day, two bits of news. One is that the balance of payments or balance of trade deficit is at the 30-year high, and yet the stock market is at an all-time high too. So how can we be importing so much more than we're exporting, and yet our companies apparently are doing better than ever?
Well, the stock market is completely divorced from reality. What quantitative easing has done, not just in Britain but also...
Is this really since QE started?
Since QE started, and we've now got a bigger debt bubble than we had before 2008, and it's the big 13th fairy at this election, which nobody's really wanting to discuss. Everybody's talking about what kind of recovery we've got, how we can make it work for ordinary people or not, and so on. And we still haven't really faced the realities that the financial system is severely broken. It was broken in 2008. It's still not been fixed. Andy, what's his name? He was the guy who did the Commons Select Committee report on this. He's a
Andrew Tyree.
Andy Tyree did quite a good report, I thought, pointing out what the problems were. But then it was...
Well, he was saying basically you've got to get retail banking and completely put an air gap between it and the casino banking,
indeed
merchant banks.
Indeed he did, and it was an all-party committee, and I thought he did a reasonable job. But it was immediately kicked into touch.
Well, it was just ignored, wasn't it?
Ignored. Yeah, because the real problem is the political power of the big banks is enormous, both here and in the US, and no government, even a left-wing Labour government, or like Syriza, for example, they can't fight these people because they're too powerful with their political power. And it's because once they've been bailed out, they're stinking rich anyway, and you've bailed them out. That puts them in a very strong position to dictate to everybody, and that's exactly what they're doing.
What are your thoughts about the macroeconomic side of things? Because, I mean, this has a big impact, particularly on things like employment, Ben.
It's huge, and I mean, it's quite... I guess we're fortunate in a way, because all of our debt problems as a nation aren't dissimilar to Greece. We're really quite like them. We've got massive, trillions that we owe. How we're ever going to pay it back? Well,
the national debt's now around about 1.5 trillion.
We won't be paid that. I mean, as Keynes pointed out in the 30s, debts that can't be paid won't be paid. Yeah. It's just a logical point. And the market solution for this is a crash. But the problem with that is that the social implications of that are unthinkable.
Well, it's always the people at the bottom that suffer the most, isn't it? Always. And we've seen that in the term of this government, to be quite
well, what
honest
bothers me is the austerity for the many has meant actually a cash bonanza for the few.
Well, that's right. There is no crisis for the people at the top. The very wealthy have done very well out of the crisis.
There's something really quite perverse about it. But anyway, one of the things that really helped me understand the money system was watching a film called The Moneymasters. Back in 1996, this was made by a chap called Bill Still in the United States. And he goes right the way back to the time of Christ, to the temple and the Moneychangers, and Jesus throwing the Moneychangers out of the temple. But why did he do that, and what were the Moneychangers in the temple actually up to?
Just who are these money changers James Madison spoke of? In the Bible, 2,000 years ago, Jesus drove the money changers from the temple. It was the only time Jesus used force during his ministry. What were money changers doing in the temple? When Jews came to Jerusalem to pay their temple tax, they could only pay it with a special coin, the half-shekel of the sanctuary. This was a half ounce of pure silver about this size. It was the only coin around at that time which was pure silver and of assured weight, without the image of a pagan emperor. Therefore, to Jews, the half-shekel was the only coin acceptable to God. But these coins were not plentiful. The money changers had cornered the market on them. Then they raised the price, just like any other commodity, to whatever the market would bear. In other words, money changers were making exorbitant profits because they held a virtual monopoly on money. The Jews had to pay whatever they demanded. To Jesus, this totally violated the sanctity of God's house.
Well, an interesting take on it, Martin, because, I mean, there is a virtual monopoly now, or an oligopoly, on the creation of money by private banks 2,000 years on.
Well, yes, and I think if you're coming back to the biblical example, don't forget that the Romans wanted their taxes to be paid in their money, which they created, and it reminds me of what the British did in Rhodesia in the 19th century, where basically people were living perfectly happily and said, you've got to pay our taxes to us in cash, which means that you've got to work on our farms to earn the cash to pay the taxes. So the money is used as a means of control, as we all know.
But surely it's the government that awards and the Treasury that awards banking licences. If they don't behave, the banks surely can have their licence taken away.
Creation. This was. I think if we go back to the 80s and the monetarist revolution, as it were, in Britain and in the US, it became increasingly apparent that the government doesn't control the money supply. The government produces coins and cash, but that's a tiny fraction of the money supply. Most money supply is created through the creation of private bank accounts and the creation of bank accounts by the private banks.
And then that money is then lent. Now,
well, there's increasing debate about this across the political spectrum, with both left and right wing people saying that the banking system should be, or the central banking system should be nationalised.
Well, it's one thing,
and that's actually the right in America are calling for the abolition of the Federal Reserve and so on. And this is quite interesting that there's this convergence going on. Actually,
I wonder. I mean, you're probably not the sort of thing you get asked on the doorsteps, but your thoughts, Ben, about the idea of having a money system which actually serves the public, because it seems increasingly that we're slaves to the money system and slaves to money. You know, we haven't got the resources we desperately need, then there's not enough to go around.
Well, I don't disagree with that, and I mean, for many things, when it comes to it could be railways and it could be health, my personal beliefs, and not necessarily of my party, are that those things should be state-owned. They are there to serve the public. So I would be all for a Bank of England that sought to look after its residents.
Well, never mind taking a monopoly on the money like the Moneychangers did in the Temple 2,000 years ago. There was another big step in the money system, and that was the fractional reserve banking system. Before we hear this clip from the Moneymasters about that, Martin, fractional reserve, what is it?
Well, basically, as we all know, if everybody turned up at a bank and asked for their money all at once, the bank would go bust because they haven't got it all. So fractional reserve banking... So
where has that actual extra money come from that the bankers lent out?
Well,
that they don't
what happens
have?
When the banks lend money out, they make it up and lend it out. Yeah, that's what they do.
So they're sort of just waving a magic wand, yeah?
Yeah, they're creating money to lend it out. And, of course, they lend out an awful lot more than they've actually got. And that doesn't matter as long as everybody doesn't turn up and ask for it at once. And fractional reserve banking is the idea that a certain proportion of their reserve, they've got to keep at least 10%, say, so that if everybody turns up at once, they've at least got 10% of the money. But of course, the fraction has now become so ludicrously small. I mean, it used to actually matter quite a lot. Fractional reserve banking, in the 50s, for example, if it was 10% or 5%, make a big difference. Now it makes hardly any difference because the actual amount of money they've got to keep in terms of the actual huge, it's becoming more and more minuscule. And in fact, more radical free market types are saying we don't need any fractional reserves at all because it's so small it's hardly worth bothering with. Well, but in other words, it's actually a house of cards.
Back in 1996, Bill Still and the Moneymasters put it like this. This is how he explains fractional reserve.
1,000 years after the death of Christ, money changers, those who loan out and manipulate the quantity of money, were active in medieval England. In fact, they were so active that acting together, they could manipulate the entire English economy. These were not bankers per se. The money changers generally were the goldsmiths. They were the first bankers because they started keeping other people's gold for safekeeping in their vaults. The first paper money was merely a receipt for gold left at the goldsmith. Paper money caught on because it was more convenient than carrying around a lot of heavy gold and silver coins. Eventually, goldsmiths noticed that only a small fraction of the depositors ever came in and demanded their gold at any one time. Goldsmiths started cheating on the system. They discovered that they could print more money than they had gold, and usually no one would be the wiser.
Then they could loan out this extra money and collect interest on it. This was the birth of fractional reserve banking. That is, loaning out many times more money than you have assets on deposit. So, if $1,000 in gold were deposited with them, they could loan out about $10,000 in paper money and draw interest payments on it, and no one would ever discover the deception.
So there you go. That's the crux of how the banks over that was actually only 1,000 years ago, not 2,000 years ago, started to circulate far more of these notes, Martin, and noticing that people didn't all come in to collect their money at the same time. But then the problem with that is, what if they do all come in at the same time? All of a sudden, you're going to get yourself some sort of a banking crash. Now, gold used to mean something. In fact, it actually says, doesn't it, on a pound note, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £1. But actually, if you take that to the Bank of England, they're not going to give you anything for it. It's just a piece of paper.
Well, the Bretton Woods system that was set up after the war in 1946, with big influence from Britain, with Keynes being involved in it, it was a gold-based system ultimately. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency, but the US dollar, in theory, could be exchanged for gold. And that means that you get the best of both worlds, in theory, because you've got it's backed up by gold, so they can't just inflate it, but it's also paper money, and therefore you can expand it or you can reduce it according to circumstances. Because the real problem with a gold-based system, that's just a gold-based system, is that there's only a certain amount of gold around, and you can't actually flexibly vary the money supply. But the problem is, in 1971, they couldn't afford to carry on fighting the Vietnam War and keep the dollar on gold. So they took the dollar off gold in order to fight the Vietnam War, which they could do because they were in a strong position. And at that point, of course, you then started to get all of the problems that we've now got, which is that they've been printing money ever since, effectively, and a massive bubble has now grown over the years in US dollars.
Okay,
is probably going to crash.
It's not the easiest question, but I'm going to ask both of you: how do we deal with this? It's like, we're in a kind of bind, aren't we? In hock, quite literally, to a handful of international bankers.
Well, I think the real problem is that they can't control the outcomes, and if ultimately...
Are we just going to have to wait for
the market will work in the end. The dollar is gradually being undermined. I mean, a lot of the wars the US are fighting are for example, they attacked Libya quite probably because they were going to bring in a Libyan gold dinar, which would then have been a standard across Africa.
A threat to the IMF.
Based on gold, which would have undermined the American position. That's right, yeah.
Okay, so how do we deal with it? Come on.
Well, I think the fact is that people all over the world are starting to deal with it. They see the Chinese have just set up an alternative investment bank to the World Bank, and Britain, amongst others, and lots of others, have all rushed forward to join into it.
But what should they be doing at the Treasury right now? I mean, doing something like the Greeks are thinking about, going back to the drachma and actually starting again from scratch?
I think the problem is that we're too far gone. When the crash happened in 2008, that was the time to start reforming the system, and we've basically done nothing for 8 years.
Isn't a forgiveness of the debt or writing off the debt?
I mean, one of the things, you either have a crash or you have an orderly write-down of the debt. You look at what the amount that Greece supposedly owes. It's fantastic, actually. It's not real what they owe. It's based on interest payments you didn't meet.
Compound interest
and so on. You say, well, you can't possibly pay that. We'll have to wipe a lot of that out. And that means that some wealthy people have to lose their money. But it's done in an orderly fashion. But if you don't do it in an orderly fashion, it will happen in a disorderly fashion. And that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah, what are your thoughts about all this, Ben?
It was Gordon Brown that said, wasn't it, I was going to end the boom and bust. And I think Martin's quite right. I don't think our system allows nothing but the boom and the bust. And in 2008, when the credit crunch happened, Martin's right. I think we should have done much, much more. I think that was the perfect opportunity to zero the books and start again and make the reforms in a moral and intellectual fashion, I guess. Nothing's happened, and I guess the only way to really to do it is to literally zero the debt, zero debts, start again, but start again properly.
That's what a crash will do.
Yeah.
But of course, the consequences of a crash socially are devastating.
They hurt, yeah.
The likely outcome of that is kind of war and conflict.
Yeah.
And at that point, once a country's gone down the drain like Ukraine has done, then you're not in a position to do anything much.
Now, Argentina had it, Russia had it, a very fast collapse of their currency. Is that the sort of thing we'd expect?
Yeah, and you'll see a ricochet effect, and contagion spreading very, very quickly. In the 1930s, after the stock market crash in the US, it took quite a while, months to years, for that to work its way through into a depression. But what will happen now is the computer screens will all go red simultaneously. It'll happen in an afternoon, and there's no way of protecting yourself from it.
This is the sort of stuff you're not going to get on the BBC.
This is not being discussed in the mainstream.
Making it clear.
This is the real problem, and nobody wants to talk about it. And it's not just because the two things about this. Politicians don't understand it, and the other thing is people don't want to hear it.
Why?
And politicians are there to get elected, and
Yeah.
they don't get elected by telling them things they don't want to hear.